Would you like us to start or? Probila sam sistem. Well, it's been 10 minutes already, so maybe it's a good idea to start. Well, dear colleagues, thank you all for coming here today for this panel discussion, Alternative Philosophizing and Philosophical Fiction. Today we will hear talks from three speakers, Stefano Gualeni, Mattia Vigato, and Luca Perušić. Stefano Gualeni is a professor and game designer at the Institute of Digital Games, University of Malta, and visiting professor at the Laguna College of Art and Design in Laguna Beach, California. As part of his academic work, he deals with the topic of virtual and fictional worlds, but also with topics such as philosophy of technology, existentialism, science fiction, and game design. He is also the author of several monographs, mainly on the topic of virtual and fictional worlds, in which he treats virtual and fictional spaces as alternative and experimental fields of thinking and being. Mattia Vigato is a teaching assistant at the Chair of Ontology, Department of Philosophy at the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, University of Zagreb. Besides being a postgraduate student of philosophy, she is also a master's student of applied computer engineering. During her studies, she received the Generation Google Scholarship and worked as a fellow at the University of Oxford. Her main areas of interest are metaphysics, philosophy of mind, and philosophy of perception. Luca Perušić is an assistant professor at the Department of Ethics at the Department of Philosophy, University of Zagreb. He is the managing editor of the journals Filozofska istraživanja and Synthesis Philosophica, and a member and founder of various professional associations. He is active in all areas of scholarly activity and advocates the concept of knowledge as a public good. Thus far, he has published contributions in the fields of complex theory and systems theory, bioethics, cosmology, philosophy of techniques, science, and play, as well as research, methodology, and problems of interdisciplinarity. Those are our speakers, and each of them will give around 20 minutes talk. We will start with Mattia Vigato, then followed by Luca Perušić, and we will conclude with Professor Gualeni's talk. Then we will have an open discussion. So, Mattia.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming. In yesterday's lecture, Stefano Gualeni showcased his video game Something Something Soup Something, where the main goal is to explain the concept of soup to aliens, and that proved to be very difficult, highlighting the challenges of defining ordinary objects. And that made me think, if, let's imagine, we encountered alien species and wanted to determine whether they had developed philosophy, we wouldn't assume that they use the same mediums as us, such as written texts, public talks, or seminar discussions. Their traditions might have forms that we can't yet even comprehend. And if philosophy extends beyond its mediums, much like art surpasses specific art forms, then questioning the constraints of traditional mediums and experimenting with alternatives, such as Gualeni, could indeed, possibly, enrich philosophy, deepen it, broaden it, and advance its development. Of course, assuming that philosophy does indeed progress. The traditional medium of philosophy is predominantly linear, non-fictional prose that uses structured argumentation. However, there were many alternatives in the history of philosophy. Parmenides used poetry on nature. Plato used dialogues involving Socrates as the main protagonist, discussing philosophical concepts with other characters. Ramon Lull in Ars Magna depicted philosophical concepts using complex rotating wheels and geometric shapes. Then Nietzsche in Das Spoke Zarathustra used the novel as a philosophical medium. Deleuze and Guattari in A Thousand Plateaus used non-linear rhizomatic approach to encourage readers to navigate the text in a non-sequential manner, and so on and so forth. In this presentation, I want to focus on the alternative mediums of philosophy, which are digital. But before I do that, I want to make a preliminary categorization of, let's say, dimensions or aspects of philosophy. And for this occasion, I divided them into, I call this philosophical bites or seeds, then philosophical methods, and lastly, philosophical exposition. By seeds of philosophy, I mean the initial sparks of philosophical inquiry that can arise from a thought-provoking question, for example, in a work of art. It is a sense of wonder and a way of thinking that most people experience at some point in their lives, especially as children. Digital media can offer new ways of planting these philosophical seeds, and one interesting way is to incorporate pop-up philosophical questions into digital content. Gualeni does that in his video game The Doors In. So there's an example when the player opens a door and on-screen text appears asking, did you really open the door? Is that really a door or just merely a group of pixels? So we can imagine these pop-up questions emerging everywhere in digital contents. And philosophers, what they do is delve deeper into these questions, approach them critically and systematically, and iterate that process repeatedly. Which brings us to the second category, philosophical methods. Timothy Williamson listed 9 philosophical methods, starting from common sense, disputing, clarifying terms, doing thought experiments, comparing theories, deducing, using the history of philosophy, using other fields, and model building. Digital media could bring something new to all mentioned methods, but I will talk about just a few of them I find the most interesting. The first one is disputing. So traditionally, philosophical disputation occurred through informal discussions in settings like pubs or formal debates at academic conferences. Digital media has expanded these opportunities by offering online philosophical forums that connect people globally. These forums often facilitate more thoughtful exchanges than in-person discussions by allowing participants time to refine their positions and carefully articulate their responses. Another useful functionality are so-called threaded or nested comments that allow users to reply directly to individual comments within a larger discussion, creating a hierarchy of responses that can help organize and structure conversations more effectively. And lastly, ChatGPT offers numerous opportunities for facilitating discussions, such as providing instant responses. Regarding the philosophical method of clarifying terms, Timothy Williamson used an example to illustrate this method of a panelist from the 20th century British show The Brain's Trust, who gained notoriety for answering questions with, "It all depends on what you mean by." This focus of clarifying concepts has its roots in the linguistic turn, a movement that emphasized the relationship between language and philosophical issues. And Wittgenstein, for instance, argued that philosophical problems often arise from confusions in our everyday language. This philosophical method could potentially benefit from digital media by linking clarifications of concepts directly to the primary text using hover text or pop-up boxes, providing additional context without disrupting the flow of the main content. Another important contribution of digital media is the use of ontologies in semantic web to facilitate data organization and integration by defining both the concepts and the relationship between the concepts in a web-like manner. There is a big progress in the so-called digital humanities, and our philosopher Josip Čirić from Zadar is one of the proponents of that kind of approach in philosophy. The next philosophical method I want to accentuate is the so-called doing thought experiments. Thought experiments are something contrasted to real-life experiments. So we can say that while natural scientists have to do and observe, philosophers can just sit in their armchairs and close their eyes and just imagine. However, we all know that theoretical physicists also can use thought experiments together with other scientists. So, can digital media add something to these thought experiments? So, these digital media could produce immersive and interactive digital depictions of thought experiments. And if we would use Hume's terminology, if we would have impressions of these thought experiments, they would be more vivid and forceful, as Hume says, than ideas. But the question is, isn't the lack of ideas an important part of thought experiments? Unlike real-life experiments that deal with actual cases, thought experiments deal with possible cases. By making a thought experiment digital, do we, in a way, although it seems that we made it more rich, did we actually impoverish it? The next philosophical method I will accentuate is deducing. So, deducing meaning deductively arguing for a view instead of just asserting it. And there is a citation I find relevant for this from Leibniz in his work, The Art of Discovery. He said, quote, "The only way to rectify our reasoning is to make them as tangible as those of the mathematicians, so that we can find our error at a glance. And when there are disputes among persons, we can simply say, let us calculate without further ado to see who is right." End quote. To enrich this philosophical method, many philosophers, such as Russell and Whitehead, were using symbolic notation. Digital media can enrich this method with tools such as argument mapping tools, such as Chialo, and automated reasoning tools, such as Carneades argumentation system, which is used for argument reconstruction, evaluation, mapping, and interchange. And also one important work worth mentioning is Socrates in the Labyrinth by David Kolb, which was written as a hypertext, a nonlinear way of presenting information that allows users to navigate through texts using links or references. And his work was inspired by the question, can we do can we do philosophy with hypertext? In more details, will hypertext enable a new form of philosophical writing, or is it simply an expository or informational tool for philosophical texts? Argument, some would say, is a crucial aspect of philosophy, and if linearity and a sense of aura or necessities are essential to it, then hypertext which lacks these qualities could seem as not well suited for philosophical argumentations. However, Kolb argues that any assumed comprehensive structure, whether narrative, philosophical, argumentative, or dialectical, operates within a broader context it does not control. And he finds hypertext particularly well suited to demonstrate this. Which brings me to the last aspect of philosophy I listed, and that is philosophical exposition, which can be defined as the presentation of philosophical ideas, concepts, arguments, and texts, and which can be see as a critical part of philosophical practice. The traditional philosophical mediums are essays, journal articles, books, lectures, presentations, etc. And digital media can bring to this philosophical dimension a lot, which is, I think, nicely listed in Janet Murray in her work Hamlet on Holodeck, the future of a narrative on cyberspace. She lists 4 characteristics that make the computer a powerful medium for literary texts, but I think it is equally applicable to the philosophical exposition. The characteristics are namely procedurality, the possibility of successive execution of rules, then participation, the possibility of manipulation of the represented world by the user. The third is spatiality, the ability to navigate through virtual space repository, and lastly, encyclopedicity, the possibility of storing a large amount of information in various media formats. The work produced in the history of philosophy is so large that it is beyond the comprehension of any person of the last few centuries. And the qualities mentioned by Murray have the power to represent philosophy in a way traditional media could never achieve. So, to conclude, digital media has transformed the landscape of philosophy, providing new methods and medium for inquiry and expression. And as philosophy continues to embrace these alternative forms, we can expect it not only to fulfill its potential, but also to evolve in exciting and innovative directions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, our next speaker is Luca Perušić.
Okay, thank you for coming. I'm very happy to be here again. We should thank also the Faculty of Media and Communication Studies here in Belgrade, because they were the ones who reached out to Stefano Gualeni, then he reached out to me, then we had an idea about hosting another event, and then I reached out to Željko and invited Matija to join us, and we are here now in this format. This is the history of today's event, and I hope that the discussion will be fruitful. Looking forward to your questions and the debate here. I would also like to mention that this was actually co-organized by our Croatian Center of Excellence for Integrative Bioethics, and you might wonder what this has to do with bioethics at all. It has to do with bioethics in the sense that under the paradigm of integrative bioethics which we are developing, we actually very much value and endorse the use of art in scientific research, in philosophical research, and believe that that persons who have specific moral problems, and then from the perspective of experts, specific ethical or bioethical problems, should actually also consult art as a form of, or a source of knowledge that they can use to kind of filter out the possible outcomes and clear up the dilemma that they are having. In that sense, a lot of the details that I'm going to mention are related to what we are doing under integrative bioethics. Today I will focus on narrative leisure video games. You'll see why. This is something that's been a bit of a obsession for me, the relation between philosophy and this specific form of games, narrative leisure video games. I'll first give you a little bit about the motive why we should do this research, what is the point of that. Then I'll talk a little bit about the presence of the philosophical itself in the form of, in the content of narrative leisure video games, and then I will give a few comments and details related to how related basically to the problem of the balance between education and entertainment when we are talking about teaching something or motivating somebody through the use of games. In terms of motive, this is basically what I'm wondering about. I've been teaching Introduction to Philosophy for about 10 years, and I've been updating that course from year to year, upscaling it and including more and more knowledge related to what philosophy is and all its dimensions. I think I pretty much covered everything up. There is one thing that I'm now, the only thing maybe that I'm anchored when teaching Introduction to Philosophy, and this is that philosophy is not just some institutional activity, rather it is a fundamental dimension of human being. It is something that we use in our orientation in the world, and I find it as a kind of a natural organic tool which can be understood as a form of good. In that sense, philosophy can be something that is outside of the institution, that should be considered as a form of natural good, or at least as a form of a social good, akin to reading and writing. And I was wondering if this is something that is to that scope useful for human beings. How can we preserve it? How can we take care of it? And how can we expand it? And how can we increase the nurturing of philosophical dimensions of human beings in the 21st century in the context of all the ideologies that are being played out on the global level, from ideologies of political exceptionalism to ideologies of free market, neoliberalism, capitalism, etc., etc., techno-scientific systems, and so on. And I see in one form in which that can be done is through games, and not just games in general, but specifically through a particular type of video games, which are actually narrative leisure video games, and I'll explain why. I will demonstrate this on the example of this problem, on the example of animal abuse, so to say. We have at least three basic modes of our experience of meeting with a specific problem. One is the argued text, which actually should be maybe called the expert text. This is our typical, or expert speech. This is our typical communication in philosophy and science, through specific form of text communication, through specific form of speech communication. We exchange particular arguments to support a particular idea or conclusion or a disposition. Another typical mode is by witnessing, by having the actual factual experience of the problem that we are talking about. It contributes in a different way. And the third form, third most common form in that sense, is through art. And when we consider the history of animal abuse and the changes that are happening in understanding whether or not and how should we treat animals, that is non-human living beings or non-human animal living beings, the art form has been the most influential in actually changing the capacity for thinking about this and actually changing people in their behavior towards non-human animals. Activists, for example, and artist activists are mostly oriented towards actually developing various forms of performances and art performances which are recognized as a medium that enhances the chances of understanding the particular problem. This to me was interesting, and this is how I started to think about expanding my activities from what they once were, from being a private developer of games and toys to then being a completely institutionalized philosopher, now going back to trying to see how we can combine games for basically mass communication of philosophy. Why I think that this is a very challenging, very interesting, why specifically narrative leisure video games, because first of all, they are meant for leisure time, which means that we are bringing philosophy to a place where it originally was in the ancient Greek. It had a specific purpose, and it operated in a place which was meant to be for emancipation of our spirits. So now we could be finding ways through the basically mass consumerism, ways of bringing philosophical approach to world back in some form. But what is most interesting about video games, specifically narrative video games, is that they first of all are massively influential. Absolutely the most influential form of art today. Second, they are founded in interventive action, and in contrast to interactive, for example, interactive theater, they do not force you to make choices, and they do not pull you into making choices. They are designed in a way that you are expected, and you know that you are going to be intervening. So it makes a difference in contrast to other forms of interactive art. They also apply procedural rhetoric, which was brought to our attention by Ian Bogost. It means that they exert a persuasive power through rule-based behavior. They also have capacity to simulate. They are infinitely expandable, and they can connect. Games in general can connect to various other dimensions of our existence, including our various forms of interaction and communication. And eventually, they are very interesting for studying the relation between education and entertainment when we are trying to combine the two elements in the upbringing and education of young people. And I've talked something about that. I've written in the paper that is coming this year, morality-based decision-making in non-narrative leisure video games as support for aesthetic cognitivism. And that being in mind, there is a difference in how we understand the presence of philosophy in art, and I think this is very important to understand the differences. The first level is the level where you do not really have a philosophical reasoning present in video games. What you have are specific situations that may stimulate philosophical reasoning, and this is very different from actually having specific forms of philosophical type of philosophical interaction. One example is the Dino Crisis from 1999 game, which is true entertainment game, but has a little bit of narrative in which there are some questions that can be brought up by the reflexive gamer. One example is the role of government in the ethics of their behavior. The second basic category is the presence of philosophical reasoning, but in layman style, which means that the philosophical expertise is not used to produce the content, the narrative content. An example is Planescape Torment, which has a lot of this type of dialogues discussing some fundamental issues, some fundamental notions in a philosophical manner through a dialogue, but which is not designed from the philosophical perspective in the sense of expertise. Then we have the third basic category, which is games which are based on expert philosophical knowledge. One example is the Swapper, which had a philosopher designing the narrative structure, which used metaphysics, philosophy of mind, epistemology, and of course, gnoseology and ontology to develop specific elements of the central narrative. And then we have what I find most interesting. These are the video games which have game-playing mechanics as a fundamental aspect of narrative, in the sense that if we take the mechanics out of the narrative falls apart, and if we take the narrative out of the mechanics fall apart. They make no sense in a standalone fashion. They are connected, which means that actually the procedural processes are being used to demonstrate a specific concept. Several examples. I started thinking about this 10 years ago when I encountered the art of Janis Valheim, who who was actually studying philosophical texts, mostly philosophical, but also sociological and psychological texts, and trying to convert the conceptual relations between the studied phenomena through geometrical forms with the aim to provide specific methodical thinking through or drawing through geometric shapes, which would lead you to understanding the relations and calming or bringing peace to your inner self. And this is an example. The right side is, the left side is the struggle of classes and revolution, how he tried to sketch that theory, and the right side is how he tried to sketch the understanding of object of understanding, which was directly based on his reading of Kant, Descartes, and other philosophers. A very interesting attempt. There is a paper, a very interesting paper on his work, which you can find online, available for free. Now, this is another example of such a type of game. This is Al Frisbee, who developed during the crisis of education in the United States of America. He developed a game through which he tried to demonstrate how evolution would work. The game is that you are playing on a grass field. You are using toothpicks, which represent prey, and you are using fork and spoon to represent the predator. So the green toothpicks are more adapted to the environment and as a prey, and the spoon is more adapted to the environment, to bringing up toothpicks as a predator, which demonstrates some basic elementary functionality of evolution. And he did that because he was forbidden to teach evolution, and he had to somehow find a way to bring the message to the students without actually teaching evolution. Another example is the Stanley Parable, which is fundamentally is the conceptualization of free will and determinism in a game. Here is an example. The narrator says, "Now listen carefully. This is important. Stanley walked through the red door, and this happened before you actually do this, and you are the Stanley who is doing this." So this is a play on determinism and free will, and if you take out this narrative, you do not have the meaning of the mechanics. If you take mechanics out, the narrative falls apart entirely. Another example is by Stefano, something soup. Something again, where you are identifying soup, identifying what is a soup and what is not a soup in a specific narrative. If you take the narrative out, you maybe have some kind of philosophical tool which cannot be really understood, and if you take the mechanics out, the narrative completely falls apart. And Quandary is another phenomenal example of this type of games. Quandary was specifically designed, it combines the third and fourth category. It was specifically designed to enhance ethical reasoning among children. It was designed by a group of experts from various disciplines, including philosophers. And it tries to combine card playing, game playing in this form of video games, and art of comics to bring the ethical problems to children and help them understand how they should act. The crucial difference, what I wanted to emphasize, is that there is a difference between serious game and leisure games in terms of how much will you sacrifice to make something entertaining, and this is the root of the problem, and we are trying to educate somebody through entertainment. And we know in game design that this is a big problem. The more we are educating, the more we are teaching with the game, the less it is fun to play, and the more it is fun to play, the less it is teaching. So we kind of, in philosophy, there is an advance to that, because we kind of have to find a way to get the message through, not necessarily details of the knowledge that we want to teach, but get the message through to enhance a specific philosophical approach. And I think that one of the key features here is that we have to make a game personal. If we are developing a narrative video game, if we want to send a message through that, we have to, this is the first designing principle, we have to make it personal. The more personal the game is felt, the more we are connected to the characters and the story which is happening, the less are the chances that the introduction of additional content which is trying to teach and educate will be treated as not being fun, or treated as being pushed on you, or treated as being in some sort of ideological. In that sense, the more personal it is, the better point you can make. Here are some of the examples of ludems that we can use and that the game designers use to challenge the player, and we can use to enhance moral challenge. And as you look at them, you can see that these are also topics that we deal with in philosophy, or tools that we actually use in philosophy to enhance the understanding of problems. So there is a very close internal connection between the medium of philosophy and philosophizing and what can be done with games and video games in particular. And this is something that is very important. The rhetorical consistency is crucial in succeeding in doing something like that, similar to how we design a paper, from what is the title to what is the conclusion to the elements of the text that have to be present. We need to be consistent within. We have to have a core message. The mechanics have to be related to the core message. They have to reflect it in some way. The choices we make have to show a trade-off just like they show in real life, in order for us to actually show the consistency of an idea that we are trying to talk about or teach about when using the form of video games. And I'll give you an example. For example, this is a fast pitch I quickly came up with. You want to create a specific game. You want to give it a general setup. You have to give it a title, and you have to define a core message, the genre, the specific game mechanics that you are going to use, and additional content. So if, for example, I want to create a game where I would like to teach players, high schoolers, for example, about different philosophical positions and how philosophical approach to the world can help them, and I want to do it from a perspective of a narrative leisure game, I want them to have fun, but I also want them to learn about philosophy without actually pushing philosophy into their face. I imagine I create a specific world where they might find interest, in which they might find interest in, and I develop, for example, that I'm a student going to the same high school where my sister was going, or brother, whoever, where she disappeared, and I'm trying to understand what is going on there. I'm trying to figure out what is going on with that. I realized there is a kind of debate club which is permeating the entire high school, and I think that they have something to do. They might have something to do with why the sister disappeared, and it turns out that it's a specific debate club which somehow relates to philosophy. So I have to define a core message. My core message of the game will be that philosophy solves problems and grants orientation. To do that, I need to find out what genre would be interesting to somebody who I want to teach about philosophy. So puzzle-based dialogue, murder mystery with mystic elements is something that will most likely be interesting to a high schooler and maybe some adults. And I develop game mechanics which are somehow trying to relate what we do in philosophy to what is going on in the game. I decide to have environmental puzzles, clues assembling. I decide to have a debate game, which will be a form of a mini game within the game, and I decide to have specific themes of moral engagement to show the depth of to show the depth of the engagement, philosophical engagement. Why do I call it Lily's dilemma? Because dilemma reflects what we are doing in the game, and there will be some specific moments in the story where we will have a specific dilemma. Why it is Lily's dilemma? Because Lily is the sister. Why Lily? Because I want to play with the mythological history of Lilith, the concept of Lilith from biblical narratives. So I can combine these various elements to form a specific interesting narrative context within which I can add specific ways of approaching philosophical approach to the world, and I can then add additional context such as philosophic codex or collectibles which do not force the knowledge of philosophy, expert knowledge of philosophy on the player, but may guide the player to see what this is going on. Then we can use hypertext, links, and all the different types of options that digital media provides to route them further into the outside world, and in that sense, for example, develop something that might stimulate philosophical reasoning. But the whole time I have to think about how to make it personal, and the whole time I have to think about not making a player feel like they are being pushed a specific worldview or specific approach to life, because otherwise I will fail in my attempt to enhance philosophical reasoning among players. And that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Luca. When will we be able to play the game? Lily's dilemma.
Just a pitch for the lecture, but we'll see.
Can I have the clicker?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, our next speaker and final speaker is Stefano Gualeni.
Hi, and thanks everybody. This was, thank you. I didn't expect this large audience, and I didn't expect such excellent presentations from my co-speakers. I never met them in person, and I'm super glad I did today. I'm talking about something kind of quirkier than what they did. They mentioned the fact that I try to present philosophical ideas and explore philosophical ideas in the form of games or interactions. Today I'm talking about something even weirder, perhaps. Let's try. It's an experiment in theory fiction. Now, I didn't know that Olga would be so kind to introduce us, so I had a quick introduction to myself. I'm going to just rush through it. This is how you spell my name, and I work in Malta, which is a tiny island full of Serbian people expatriating for work because wages are higher there, and English is our main language, so okay. I'm not Maltese myself, I also moved for the same reason. I also work in California, in Japan, a number of places, and if you heard about my work, like I used to find people in front of me, is because I try to present academic ideas in interactive and presumably playful fashions. I talked about that game yesterday in a different talk. Okay. There's a few others that they mentioned, something soup something, which is about family resemblance with Wittgenstein, analytical categories, and here that is about indexicals and how to explain indexicals. I use it with my students. They're free, they're short, you can play with a browser, so some of my friends give them out as playable homework. Some others as conversation starters. If you're interested in looking into them, they are available for free on my website. You can definitely do that. Today I'm going to go, as I told you, in a slightly different direction. As an academic, I also do more traditional work. I'm not just somebody who has fun with philosophical ideas. I also suffer through a number of books, and more books, and more books, and I think one more is not coming out. I don't know. Okay, yeah. I'm going to talk about this one today, which is one of the most recent publications. I don't know how Routledge was so insane to let me try something like this, but it's out and you can read it. The story that I want to tell you about, which is about that book, starts in Malta, as in I work there, and it's actually set in Malta. There's a fiction part to that publication. But the story of today starts, obviously, because we are in a philosophy department in ancient Greece, around 370 BC, where this famous face, Plato, considered to be the founding father of written philosophy in the West, published a fictional or semi-fictional dialogue called the Phaedrus, which I presume maybe everybody apart from Ivan, who comes from a different kind of education here, is familiar with this Platonic dialogue. Why the Phaedrus in particular? In Platonic dialogues, as you of course know, and I think I'm stating the obvious, Plato tells the quasi-fictional or entirely fictional story of how his mentor, Socrates, confronts some notable Athenian people on topics that are of philosophical relevance, such as justice, the good life, courage, and so on and so forth. They generally take place in Athens, and the Phaedrus is the only one that does not take place in Athens. There's generally some passers-by or some interlopers, and this is the only dialogue with only two characters. These two characters are Socrates on the one side and a young Athenian scholar called Phaedrus. As I mentioned, this is the only dialogue that does not take place in Athens. In fact, it's a hot summer afternoon in the valley of the Issus, where Socrates went to, in a way, cool down from the, I don't know, hot summer in the city. According to the narrative of this dialogue, they are resting under a tree, waiting for the afternoon heat to dissipate. One thing I didn't mention is that Phaedrus just came back from Athens the same day in which he meets with Socrates, and he comes back with a parchment of sorts. You need to remember that parchments in classical Greece were not something normally used in social use. They were used for accountancy, for example. Socrates himself talks about the use of writing for not forgetting things in your old age and stuff like that, but they were not normally used in social and cultural processes. So it was quite weird for Phaedrus to carry a parchment. In the parchment was a speech that he listened to a few days prior by a famous speaker called Lysias. It's a speech about love, right? Especially, it's a speech about love with your students and how you should be sexual with your students, especially male students, because that was the case back then. This part of the Phaedrus, as you understand, did not age particularly well. So I'm now going to be talking about having sex with your students and the modalities of it. Another topic of this speech is, and you of course know, you're all being philosophers here, is the immortality of the human spirit. There's a very famous metaphor that is used in this dialogue about the two-winged soul. Have you heard about? Maybe not. Anyway, I'm not going to talk about this either. One thing that is somewhat relevant to what I want to talk about today is the fact that the two interlocutors talk about the influence of writing in culture. As I mentioned, it was a newly introduced technology for some social processes. And as you remember in your education, Socrates was like, oh, books are going to make us so stupid and forgetful, and we should probably not use books in the context of society and culture. This is coming back, but it's also not what I'm going to be talking about today. What I'm going to talk about today happens in the last two little pages of the Phaedrus, where Phaedrus himself has a question. He goes like, hey, yes, I have a question. Yes, Socrates, I have a question for you. Yes. Do you think writing, this new technology that I've been talking about, is any good for presenting ideas and arguments? Obviously, this is a question asked in a context of presumably philosophical reflection. And Socrates thinks about it. For context, in case you're not coming from a philosophical background, we do not have texts authored by Socrates. So he apparently didn't leave anything or anything that we can put our hands and eyes on. But we know from Plato's writing that Socrates considered the search for truth to be the goal of philosophy. And it's not a question or a set of questions that could be answered definitively or once for all. According to Socrates, this pursuit for truth is something that is dynamic, that needs to keep going throughout society through social changes or technological changes. And it's a process of social negotiation and progressive clarification. Clear. As such, when our search for truth needs to adapt to social and technical context of a certain community and take into account their preferences and capabilities. From that point of view, Socrates thought dialogue is the best thing you can do in this day and age. He was against like writing philosophy. When I try to understand why in the Phaedrus, I originally thought like if this is where he's coming from, then perhaps he doesn't want to use text and writing because in a way the text becomes dogmatized, right? It becomes an object. It's not part of this kind of discussion that we have. And you might think that it represents some kind of objectified, bona fide truth. So crystallized in the form of text, ideas remove themselves from the dialectic process and risk becoming unquestionable dogmas. This is what I expected Socrates to say, no, we need to keep discussing ideas. Putting them into stable forms is not a good idea. This is, however, not how he counters that idea in this particular dialogue. In fact, it's kind of weird and selfish and kind of a bit patronizing when he says, without me there to explain you my point, you might either misunderstand because we're not perhaps equally skilled, or maliciously try to use it for your own scopes. So I need to be there to understand whether you get it, and if you don't get it, to present better examples or correct you, right? It's a testament to the fact that he didn't believe his listeners were particularly trustworthy. Despite what Socrates thought, we continue to publish books in philosophy and more books, and I'm also guilty with my own books and so on and so forth. So what I'm trying to say here, together with another philosopher called Kittler, is that we seem to have stopped asking that question. As in, we seem to be accepting that philosophy has now a form since, I don't know, Plato's time, which is that of a expert text, as Luca said, either developed orally or maybe through, let's say, papers, articles, books, whatever you publish in your practice. And he goes something like, philosophy is this method, which is about pursuing the truth with self-scrutiny, rigor, self-checking why we think certain ways and why we say the things that we say. How come we stop thinking about the mediality of the practice? We seem to have given for the past 2,000 years for granted that philosophy is something that you do textually, or at least through expert language, maybe in the form of a lecture, maybe in the form of a text. So, in his words, we stopped asking Fedor's question, right? We forgot that he ever asked, hey, is this a good idea? Obviously, Kittler is not the only one. I'm pretty sure that they mentioned a number of other scholars. I want to bring up Bogus, for example, who's a game scholar and philosopher, who says, if we think about it, like the academic production of knowledge in the textual form is an institutional dogma. I'm pretty sure everybody here is either a PhD student or a staff member, and so your promotion, the quality of your work, your progress in your career depends or is normally evaluated on the basis of text, right? Where did you publish? What's the I factor of the journal you published in? Did you publish with a big publisher or a small publisher, and so on and so forth? So one, if not the main criteria for whether you escalate in your career, together with funding maybe, is whether you publish this particular kind of output. This is not really a question, right? Like, this is what is expected of you, and many people just take it as a given. Not true for every form of academia. As a matter of fact, artistic research, practice-based design, research through design, or performance and art research tend to have a easier way with alternative ways of philosophizing. One example could be A.D. Carson's PhD in 2017 was about hip-hop and ethnomusicology and was produced as a CD. With, instead of, let's say, the canonical 10, 12 chapters of a PhD, 10, 12 tracks in which he references and explains his point in the form of a hip-hop record. You might have heard of PhD dissertation being made in the form of comic strips. I don't know if you heard. There's at least a couple of examples. And I was also involved in an academic journal in game studies, which not only requested papers, but also slices of games or small games that prove a certain critical point. In fact, my name is over there. Yeah, the way I see it, also philosophy could be in a way non-antagonistic to other media forms. For example, in my case, I try to look at games from a philosophical angle and make games that explain or attempt to make philosophical points. As I mentioned, there are a few. Mattia and Luca are kind enough to have played some of them in their experience. There's the soup one, the indexical one about fictionality and virtuality, a bunch of them. For example, this one is about subjective idealism, and I made a game in which you take that position inevitably, and the game reveals to you that you are approaching a game world in that way exactly. Mattia already mentioned that, there's a game about soups and explaining soups to aliens based on Wittgenstein idea, okay? I recently published Doors, which was the topic of yesterday's conversation. That is a game that allows you, or better, prompts you to think about topics like fictionality, virtuality, agency in the context of a video game, based on the work of philosophers of fiction, including Kendall Walton, which you see here represented. So I think I wouldn't say I've been successful. I tried. Some people liked my attempts, some people criticized my attempts. But the point I'm trying to make here is not like, hey, now we have new media, therefore we can finally solve the problem of philosophical mediation. I'm not saying that what you see here or what I've done is a solution to the problem raised by my co-speakers. I don't believe that interactions or world-like experiences are necessarily the solution, but it adds to our vocabulary. It adds to the possibility for us to express ideas maybe in the public, or as part of research projects. If you have written European projects now, you know that you're also incentivized to do interactive divulgation of your results and so on. As an example, I'm mentioning the fact that in my games, text is not excluded from the philosophical modes of communication. There is text explaining the point of the game, and on the websites of the game, you can download authors' descriptions or the academic papers that I wrote about that experience and so on and so forth. So if we take the website itself as a philosophical output, it contains text in a variety of fashion. It's not only, hey, this is interaction and it's a new thing. No, I mean, I'm not excluding text from the process. All the games that I mentioned have text in the game, more text in the game, text on the website in which things are explained. I mean, the relationship between this kind of stuff and thought experiments and the role of the doer and the player in all these kinds of things. Doors, same way. There's text in the game, text in the game, text on the website, papers published on it, available there. So once again, you see this is in a way like an argument for hybridity. Use more media forms rather than sticking to text. It's not like use games and computers and everything will be solved. Not attempting to say that. The topic of non-exclusivity was mentioned in, of course, my early book with Palgrave, and it's kind of the point that I wanted to raise in relation to this new thing, and we are approaching the conclusion in which I explain you, hey, what the heck am I trying to do with this new experiment? So this book is something that I called an experiment in theory fiction, which is also the title of this quick talk. It was published last year in September, and it's a very quirky thing because I tried to do philosophy using fiction in a strange new way. In this case, it's not interactive fiction like in the case of video games. It's linear fiction. But so what did I do? I'm not exploring new technologies, but new uses of text. It's a text, just not simply a theoretical one. Let's see what I mean. This is not a particularly new idea. If you are experienced in philosophy, like you know that, for example, Phaedrus, I told you many times, it's a presumably largely fictional text. If you read the writings of Kierkegaard under many pseudonyms, you know that he wrote fictions to explain philosophical points. Other books are very famous, like Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, considered to be philosophical novels because they tackle points that could be considered and authors that could be considered philosophical. Other examples, science fiction, often considered to be speculative literature and philosophical in some cases, like in the case of Ursula Le Guin. The existentialists wrote plays and novels, and you know Sartre and Camus and all the spiel about that one. So in that sense, I'm not doing anything new with this particular experiment. So what's new about what I'm trying to do? Oh, yeah, of course, as mentioned also by Mattia, another use of fiction that is typical in philosophy is, well, there's at least two like fictional cases and thought experiments in which those kind of fictional scenarios stimulate our intuition and guide our thinking to giving an answer to a particular problem. And you probably know some, Donald Davidson's Swamp Man or Mary's Room. I mean, if you studied philosophy, you're familiar with all those ideas. What's special about this one is that it's a hybrid text. So it's not just a philosophical novel, but it's a weird thing made like a cocktail. In which sense? So The Clouds here is 8 parts of fiction. There's a novella, which has a science fiction tone, so it thinks about certain relations to technology, whatever. 3 parts of non-fiction, 3 canonical essays, and 1 dash of meta-reflection. So there's 3 modalities of text in the same volume. Between the 2 covers, you find a novel, essays about the novel, and a meta-reflection. So ultimately, you could say that there's something like philosophical ideas that are about 4 or 5 presented in the novels, philosophical ideas presented more canonically, but they're the same ideas in the form of papers and traditional essays, and then the afterwards in which I try to connect the dots and reflect on this new media use. I'm almost done, actually, almost finished. Also, this idea is not new. There are, in fact, novels and fiction works that are philosophically relevant because, like in the case of Dreamweaver, the author does something similar to what Mattia was saying. So this idea of adding comments and side notes to a text to explain certain philosophical points. So this book can be read as a novel if we don't read the footnotes and side notes, or we can stop every time the author wants to tell us something or to reflect on something, and we can take a detour, right? It's a sort of like hypertext or 2 novels or 2 texts as one, like a fictional one and a theoretical one that are working next to one another. My friend Federico Campagna wrote recently Prophetic Culture, which is a philosophical text that does both things. And I made this gesture because fiction goes from in this sense in the book, and theory goes in the opposite sense, in a sense that they are playing in counterpoint to each other. It's a bit hard to explain. Maybe if we have time later, I can try again. And very recently, Helen de Cruz, John de Smet, and Erik Zwischgabel published this book called Philosophy Through Science Fiction Stories. What they do is that they have short science fiction stories, then a note by the author about what's philosophical and what thought they try to propose, and then an academic writing a piece on the same idea. So in the same book, you have a set of small stories, a set of author reflections, and a set of critical/theory reflection on the book. So you see, like these three books, however, it's a bit of a rare thing, combine fiction, theory, and often metacriticism. So a way to assess how the two work next to one another. So maybe it's not the most original thing, like philosophers have done this before, but I hope that as part of the discussion we're having here, I hope that kind of convince you that we as philosophers and academics are not under any restriction to limit our communicative and expressive range to just theoretical texts. We could use, as they proposed today, and I also did, philosophical video games or virtual worlds experiences without necessarily them being playful. They mentioned hypertext. In other fields like the philosophy of image and the philosophy of movie, there is indeed another push of a similar kind of, can films be philosophical outputs? And so the discussion is way larger than what I'm presenting here. However, I hope I convince you that, well, we have nothing to lose, and there's a new ground to explore in using multiple, even textual modality in this traditional mode of communication. So there's possibility of innovating how we do and think about philosophy, even without necessarily changing medium, right? It can be a more modest way of trying to break the paradigm. I hope that was okay, and I was not too silly presenting this idea, and I thank you so much for inviting me again. I love being here and not having to work in Malta and stuff. Right? Thanks, thank you.
Thank you, Stefano, and thank you all.
I hope this was okay. I mean, I'm a bit silly in my presentation, so if you're used to something more formal, I apologize.
Your presentation was excellent, as well as both presentations before. And now I would like to open discussion. We already have one question, and I would like to add that you can also comment on each other's presentations, if you like.
Just as something to open the discussion. I'm thinking about it what Socrates say in Phaedrus about the author, and probably have a non-narcissistic interpretation of it, because this could mean also that we have no living other in written word, so in some way the other we encountering is immobilized. Probably this is not what Socrates wanted to say, but I think here is important. In dialogue, the other is ready to respond and to adapt or change even his arguments, and we have some of this communicating other in a text, but he's immobilized in written words. And probably it's even a question where the alternative medias, especially games, can help, because, in particular with the ethical dilemma, because we can experience and encounter developed other fictional character, empathize with them, and encounter the change in the argumentation that happen in the dialogue. So just open the question in that.
You're raising a fantastic point, actually. Luca already mentioned that one of the key ways that we look at games as cultural objects right now is through the lens of rhetorics. So we take them as a intentional communicative artifact that want to take you, the player, from point A to a certain realization at point B. So there's a path there that is prepared for you by a designer, right? Imagine also a movie, right? That it tries to bring a story home or a point home. There are some games that are designed not necessarily with a dialectical idea, with a rhetorical idea in mind, but with a dialectical idea in mind. So leaving the possibility for the player to explore and find their own path. A midway of that one is games with multiple endings, for example. In the case of Detroit Become Human, which is a game that explores what it is to be human and what's going to be our relationship with artificial intelligence, has over 40 possible finales. You could still say this is not truly dialectical because the player cannot have their way as they want it. There's still going to be like a finite state in which the game ends to. There are recently some games which try to, maybe with the help of AI, to truly be this kind of discursive tool, leaving the discussion open. So letting the artifact be more than just a testament of how the author saw a certain number of projects and ideas, and leaving, they're like more open-ended kind of experiences. I just want to mention, for example, the soup game doesn't necessarily let you win or lose, but what it does is, at the end of the experience, spits back a definition that corresponds to the choices that you made. So in a way, you're arguing with yourself and you get like an answer to your standpoint at the end. So there's an exponential number of variations that you can define soup as, meaning that it tries to take a bit of that possibility into account. Sorry if I went for so long, but all I'm trying to say is that there is a dialectical possibility also in our relationship with this media. We might not be experts yet. We started to do these things just at maybe 10, 15 years ago. So we're just at the infancy on how to use these media communicatively and philosophically. So that is a fantastic question because this is where we are right now. So thank you very much for the question. Do you have to add something?
I could add how we can exemplify. I'm sorry if I miss in response. You can guide me to the proper path if I misunderstood, but I didn't want to repeat what Stefano said. I would just like to add an example how through which we can see the powerful possibilities of this interventive action, and how we can make bridges across gaps that traditional form of art had. I think that the best possible example is the Last of Us series in contrast to the Last of Us video game. The first episode, the scene where the child you see dies at the beginning and creates the character of Joel throughout the story. Now, when you are watching a series, you see this or hear about this as something that you do not participate in. And in a video game, and this is in the format of the film, it is not possible to do what they did in a video game. And what they did in a video game is absolute brilliance in terms of how to make an instant connection between yourself and what you are playing or experiencing through the game. In a video game, you begin as the girl, which then dies. So you begin as a girl, you play a character which then dies, you basically die, and then you take the role of the father whose child have died. So you have an instant connection, and the way they did it was, it was also obviously aesthetically of high quality, because the girl is interesting character, the father is an interesting character. But this kind of experience that you yourself have died as a character, and now you're playing another character, who suffers from the event which you experienced yourself, because you yourself have also died through that character. It's something that you cannot do in other traditional forms of media. The closest you can do with that is some variant of interactive fiction, where you can make choices when you're reading a chapter, and then at the end of the chapter you have an option to make a choice. Would you jump on the page 34, jump on the page 69? But and if, for example, in interactive theater, you could be drawn into a play and then embody something specific and then experience some form of interaction. But these elements are actually playful elements. These elements are not part of that particular art. These elements are actually part of games as art. So they include gameful elements, playful elements they include interactivity with which you play, and then you kind of manage to make, to bridge gaps that traditionally where we are passive participants cannot do. Another form, for example, is performative art. which can also actually embody a lot of these interactive, playful elements, or performance art, performative art in combination with dance, which also actually includes various forms of playful activities and uses this playful dimension to communicate with another. So it has a powerful capacity to actually realize what is being mediated.
If I may add, so artificial intelligence was mentioned, but also we can mention multiplayer games in which literally more than one person is in one virtual space. But it seems to me that in encountering other, the very important element is this second perspective. So not seeing something as an object, something in the perspective, nor seeing yourself through the first perspective. But we can ask what exactly do we get with this sense of a second perspective. Do we maybe have the more prominent feeling that that entity exists or is in front of me in some way? But this embodiment, make-believe, is also something that which not only produce this sense of other, which plays with the sense of myself, because I'm always re-questioning what am I by putting myself into another, and by changing characters I play with. For example, in The Last of Us, the second part, we have these moments, and also in Detroit Become Human. So the very moment when you become the character, there is that sense of otherness, and also finding yourself. And just to add something, you mentioned the philosophy of film. So what can film bring to philosophy, which is not just text in a form of dialogues of characters in movie and etc. And we can all ask the same for video games. So is there something which is not text-based that can facilitate philosophical reasoning? And it seems to me that we could maybe find it in this this embodiment, in this subjective experience, because there is something strange happening. We can find it also in metaphor. For example, Graham Harman talks about it, the importance of embodiment for the experience of metaphor, and via metaphor we can approach the real world more closely. So there is something like that happening in video games, and it seems to me that you cannot really find it in any other way. So doing philosophy through practice can be maybe find in the problem of subjective experience, which is, in my opinion, one of the most important philosophical questions today. But my question for you is, what do you think that we achieve, and what is the benefit of having the other in the experience of gaming? Why is it so important? Is it the emotional engagement, since you are doing philosophy of emotions?
Regarding what you said, I just have a dilemma if the having other in conversation, because phenomenologically it is important, and what you said, that you have second perspective, which involves that you are addressed by the other, and not just that. And I would say that it's a bit different when you are having engaged experience as other. So being a girl is a different experience than being addressed by the girl. But why I'm not in the topic now, I just have the intuition that probably Željko with hermeneutics can say something about it more, that having the other who is equal member of the communication, which is not exactly necessary case with the book, is important part. So the other who respond and who can adapt its argument, it changed the quality of communication. But what I'm sure that is important is relating to ethical questions. So by playing video games and having the other, not just being in a position of some another, but if you can make decisions which can hurt, for example, the other character in the video game, which whom you have at least fictional kind of empathy, I think can develop at least your sense for ethical problems. So you can experience what it means to hurt other by some your decision in some consequences, and that is, I think, very important. I think that this moment is more is harder to achieve in a mere imaginative thought experiments than cognitive problems. So imagining houses or something like it.
No, just wanted to say that what Maciej says is spot on, and the same with you. What is specific about this medium, as I see it and many other researchers do, is the kind of experiential knowledge that they give you. As long as, again, it's subjective imagination at play and not something that is lived through, then you get to a different kind of knowledge. And it's close to the discussion we had yesterday about conceptual art, works very much in the same way. It puts you in a position of having a direct, subjective relationship with something that doesn't come with an answer. And that stimulates processes that are not the same as me sitting down and telling you passively to receive argument from A to B. If you want to have some material, if you're interested in that question, that we can share. That's it. Material that we can share. We can talk about this.
I just wanted to add that in terms of this ethical challenging of a player and the ethical situations in the games, we do have to pay attention that to the fact that how a player is constructed, and if we really want to make an impact, we have to consider the possibility that you are not having a reflective, sensible player all the time playing the game. Players, for example, they have an ethical dilemma to choose, and then they make a choice based on which character they would like to keep on having. For example, in games like Detroit Become Human, which players would I like to, who would I like to keep and who would I like to kill because they annoy me. And this is not something that maybe would happen in real life. Maybe this is not something that could happen in real life. Maybe. Maybe I said, yeah, maybe, because perhaps in some great situation where you have to choose a person, maybe you're going to choose the one you like more, right? But in any case, maybe it would not happen with that simplicity with which it is made in a game. And also, there is also the case where you're kind of trying to explore different options to see, not to see what will it do to a character, but to see how the story will go on. So, for example, I choose to kill somebody because even though I would not usually do that, or I wouldn't do it in a game, particularly unless I realize that something will happen if I do that, and I want to see what will happen. Or, for example, when you know that you can make a choice in the game, if you kill somebody, you're going to get a great item. So I make a choice to kill somebody which I don't like, or maybe I do like, but I'm going to kill because I need a particular item. And people often, when game designers, when they create content like that, they often make mistakes in designing by combining elements of what is effective in a game through mechanics too much with what is essentially a problem, an ethical problem. So sometimes you have to not allow them an ethical decision or challenging. You just have to do something that will make them react. And I think a really perfect example of that is in Little Nightmares first part, where you start as a kind of a cute little girl in a raincoat, and you see that she's exhausted, she's tired, and she goes through a horrific environment, obviously trying to save her life. And there are points where she becomes hungry, and at each point she becomes more and more hungry. And then you slowly encounter little cute characters that actually help her. and then you also run away from large enemies that demonstrate that she's in some kind of a ship where they prepare children for meals. And so eventually you come to a spot, to a place, to a point in game where she's very hungry, and the little character, kind of like gnome or something like that, is offering her meat to eat. But she throws that meat away and attacks the good character and eats it. And at that point, it was a shock to a lot of players, because they thought that they are playing a good character, and they liked her, and they communicated with that. And then it turns out that you're actually playing a character that is actually potentially evil, which then they emphasized in the second game, where she actually where she is a character that exploits your own character. And in this second game, you know this, and you are constantly thinking, when is she going to drop you or exploit you or use you for her game? So this was a situation in which you were thrown, and where you experience a specific moral event. She calculated, she attacked, she has hit a character that was helping her in an environment that was dangerous. And this is sometimes a better thing to do to motivate a player to think about what has happened than actually allow them to make dilemmas, decisions, or something like that. So we have to be very careful with designing this.
I would like.
Yeah, I have a topic for discussion. So Luca, in his classification of the presence of philosophy in video games, mentioned as the fourth category philosophical concepts as essential mechanics. So when we remove those mechanics, the game just falls apart. So the reasoning behind that could be that video games are the special form of art because they have these mechanics as a specific form of expression. So yes, they have elements of movies, music, etc., but mechanics is the artistic element which is just special to video games. And if we use philosophy in video games in some other aspects of that, we didn't achieve a really philosophical game in that sense. And on the other side, you said that in some of your games, you put philosophy in texts, and you don't try to avoid text in reaching something else. And in that sense, you are not medium essentialist. So, and that reminded me of your colleague yesterday, and his answer when I asked him if he's doing musical video games. Why is he so focused on visual representation? Why doesn't he use 3D spaces and 3D models, 3D objects of sound objects? And he said that he actually thinks that the context is a very important part of music. So my question is, why wouldn't philosophy, why is this opposition to philosophy being textually based, but in another context, whether it is a video game or something else? Why this forcing philosophy to be expressed in something which is actually, at least according to its tradition, alien to her? Don't we give something new to the medium by changing the context of text? So this is a question for both of you and maybe for you in the audience.
I'm not sure I can answer this. I can, though, counter your premise, perhaps, in a sense that you take this essentialistic point of view according to which the special thing about video game is their interactivity regulated by a system of rules. And yeah, it's an assumption, but at the same time we had social practices working that way before we had the digital medium. Think about analog and tabletop play, but also improvisational theater, but also ergodic text. Ergodic, I mean text with sort of branches. By ergos is a path in which you can go through a certain path and have the book respond with certain rules and rearrange, so to speak, the message that you're going to receive from the piece of medium. So these kind of positions are quite common in game studies, in which we try to debunk the idea that there's an exceptionality to the digital medium experience of worlds. It is also true that, as you mentioned before, they offer a quasi-world-like phenomenological experience, and perhaps in that they're a bit different from the other kind of media that we talked about. But again, what we did in most games could be done in improv theater, or in, for example, have you heard about Augusto Boal's theater of the oppressed, in which the audience could also participate and have a say in changing the plot? The only special thing here is that within video games, the rules of nature are not necessary. So they're contingent to the design situation. But the rest of the practices, we've seen it before in other social practices. So I always resist a little bit when we take this new technology that we are exposed to and go like, oh, this is a brand new social element here that will do something different. Ultimately, it's not so hard. It's not so different. So I would perhaps counter that idea. We could put text in all other things, board games, theater, improvisation, performative arts. Would you think that we'd encounter the same rejection, or I mean, would we still think about those as non-philosophical media? I don't know. I think that's perhaps a more interesting question than, is the context of text important, perhaps? Sorry, but yeah, I don't have a better answer than this one. Maybe Olga has something, I don't know.
Luca or Mattia want to continue this line of.
Well, we should keep in mind that text was alien to philosophy in its origins. It was considered something. It was considered non-philosophical. It was considered to be something that will destroy the very idea of Greek philosophy. It was different in India and China, but still, philosophy basically originated through thinking and talking and communicating. So I'd say that essentially we have to think about what is the aim of philosophy. It may be the search for the truth. It may be the identification of the nature of things, which is basically the search for the truth. And if this is something that is essentially philosophical, and doing this eventually through experience of doing that brought us a specific understanding that some ways of doing that is better than other, arguing, communicating, resisting, or not resisting, sorry, defending or attacking theses, ideas, arguments in a specific way. Then we should actually endorse all possible modes of communication that can contribute to that activity. Which brings me to something that we began to talk about, which is this idea of being a philosopher who is in academia, who is receiving his or her salary, their salary, who is considered a prominent member of philosophical community, but does not publish texts, rather publishes games, does art, exclusively speaks. And this is something that is completely unrecognized by the system, and no system in the world today, institutionalized system of philosophy today, could understand how this is scientific or how this can bring points to my career and advance my position. This is something that I would like to, for example, hear your thoughts on that. You know, how when we had, I can give an example in Filosofska istraživanja and Synthesis Philosophica. At some point when I was a younger editor, I approached my chief editor and asked him what he thinks about reviewing philosophically relevant medium beyond books. And of course, he was strictly against it because that makes no sense. Then I asked the younger chief editor what he thinks about it, because he's younger, because he's more playful. He kind of liked the idea, but the context was, please try to explain explicitly how this is relevant for philosophy. So even at this very, very, very kind of tiny element in the entire structure of philosophical scientific communication, we have resistance to the idea that there are other ways which would actually be academically approvable. So what makes a philosophical text academically approvable? The fact that I had 50 citations in it, the fact, or what makes it, and how, you know, imagine that you there as an assistant professor want to be a full professor, you come to a commission, sort of commission to evaluate you, and you say, I didn't publish anything, but I made 20 philosophical games. Yeah,
because I just did it, like I'm done with my application for full professor. I didn't just go there with games and say like, hey, why don't you give me a bigger salary here? The theory was the one I showed you before. We can do hybrid kinds of output. There can be text, there can be books, there can be games. And the interesting thing here that you might want to consider is that I've been in a sort of commissional hearing with APA, the American Philosophical Association, you know, like the citation methods and MLA, and they are starting, many of them already, to embed software and games as part of how things are cited officially, right? So in a way, giving a mark of credibility that this is output that we can reference as intellectually relevant sources. As a matter of fact, now Google Scholar also accepts pieces of software and games as something that you can be referenced for. Right? So as a matter of fact, if you go and see Doors and Soup, they have their own little citation number next to it. Am I saying Google is the authority here? No, but there's an effort on bibliographical library science and the academic community to be a little more compromissory, a little wider in what can be accepted as a source of knowledge. So personally, in answer to you, this is already changing. I was in front of a commission with games as well. I am listed in Google Scholar also for my games. When I make a game, I submit it to the library of the University of Malta, and they can archive it. So you see that there's already like a tiny little bit of a difference. I don't know if I see it because I'm biased and I want to see it, and I'm pushing for that to happen, or if really there's a change of tide. I don't know if it's true in Serbia, in Croatia, but in Malta, which is a pretty laid back and not necessarily super progressive country, this is already happening. And Google is already doing it. And American association like MLA and APA now can accept, they even give a recommendation of how to cite games and pieces of software within an academic text. So I don't think this is necessarily a matter of why is it not happening. I think it's happening.
It is still not without having a text. You still have to kind of you know, mold it into this type of still classical form of communication.
I'm not sure, because, for example, in the way you cite it, you don't need to have a text attached to it. There's a way to cite a game as an independent entity. So there doesn't need to be a text attached. Culturally, I benefit from having a text attached because we're still in a phase in which text is considered to be a primary philosophical academic output. So I cannot dream of doing only that. I think we're not ready for that one. But instead, the other dream, that of using more media forms together, talking with one talking and commenting or proving or criticizing one another, might be beneficial for a number of reasons that Macia was very clear about, like the way in which we can have different kind of arguments, the specialized things, have an experiential relationship with this kind of imagination, and a bunch of other pluses. Should we use games or simulations in all kind of philosophical problems? Absolutely not. Another thing that they didn't mention is that it costs a lot of time and money to make those things. I don't know how long it takes you to write a piece of paper, but the games that I show you each took about a year of work part-time and about 10,000 euros of me paying other people because I'm not doing everything, right? So I don't think you take a year and 10,000 euros to publish your output. So there's a difference also in how convenient and who reviews this stuff. How do you do peer review for games? If I make a philosophical game as an output, who is going to be a judge of whether it reaches the objective? So that is more like the institutional issue, not as much as it being recognized. But peer review of games, we've tried it in 2016, and it was, of course, a mess. and we try. So we were submitting.
That's what I was aiming at.
Right.
But did this because it throws you back to this strict form, the idea behind scientific activity. Yeah.
Review as as another one of the hallmarks of whether you're doing well or not in your practice, which is also questionable.
Which is in itself troublesome,
Yeah.
because there have been dozens of studies showing how it's actually not really effective. In many cases, not effective. Yeah.
Sorry, I said my piece. But
No, thank you.
Well, I think definitely in this discussion, you all managed to show the advantages of games as a medium. To a great extent, because they activate different capacities than the usual traditional associated with philosophy, like logical reasoning, text interpretation, this kind of argumentation and using concepts and definitions that is typical for philosophy, but rather emotional, more intuitive ways of understanding through examples faced with direct decision makings, more practically oriented ways of understanding the problems that are relevant for philosophy. So on the other hand, you showed that, and that was interesting to me. You argued for the hybrid version for connecting and not completely losing the text, the textual or the traditional way of philosophizing, but combining it with these new, relying more on fiction, etc.
wherever convenient, of course, because text is so easy, right? Like we are used to it, and it's economical to produce. Right? I'm not saying. Actually, most of the time, it's not convenient to veer away from text.
Yes, yes. And when you asked about so why text and why other forms are not considered scientific, well, there is one element where fiction in general is not considered scientific. So video games, insofar as they're fictional, or literature, while literature is not considered scientific. So that's one element of it. The other element is why talks, just giving talks is not enough, why text is needed. There is this economic moment. One can read more pages of texts and simply have more information by reading in a shorter period of time than by listening to talks. On the other hand, yes, it would make sense in these days, especially when talks can be recorded, that they are also included more in this, for like in this academic, for promotions, etc. Just valued as an academic contribution more than they are, I think. Because before, when Socrates was discussing on Agora, it was just an ephemeral moment. You have a talk and then that's it. But now we can actually re-listen to talks. And talks can have much wider audience. So this should be acknowledged, I think.
One of the ways how this is something when I ask my students, you know, why will I disallow you to answer me to study Shakespeare as a source of philosophical reasoning, but I will allow you to study. I will ask you about Plato's dialogues, which are basically fiction, just because they are discussing particular things in a particular way. And there is this moment where, you know, where's a difference between, you know, scientific account and non-scientific account. I think essentially it is in at the court. You know, the court will never allow a fictional account to be presented as a proof for something. while non-fictional account will be allowed as a proof of starting. So I think that we can use this as a criteria to what degree something actually communicates scientifically and to what degree it communicates as a fiction. But it's very strange. To me, it's very strange to deny a theatric performance or a film or a song or a dance or a video game in general, not just video games, tabletop games, games that children play, childhood games or stuff like that, to deny them a form while we are allowing Plato's dialogues to essentially be scientific literature. I mean, even scientists who are not philosophers use Plato's dialogues to argue things in favor, which is very strange, because it's actually fiction, or Bruno's dialogues, or Leibniz dialogues, and so on. I think it's kind of a unresolved paradox, which means there's actually something wrong with it. Either we should not use Plato as a source, or we should allow more art to be used as source for scientific communication.
And on what you consider by science or philosophy. For example, if you take continental philosophy, is considered by some as a form of literature. And the authors of continental philosophy often express themselves in literature. So perhaps there are some forms of philosophy that are less resistant to that idea. I mentioned the existentialists having, for example, theater plays or short stories or novel to explain certain points. Think of Sartre's Nausea, for example, or The Man in Revolt by Camus. And there didn't seem to be much resistance there, right? I mean, that was still part of the philosophical practice. So perhaps if you're an analytical philosopher, you might be like, no, absolutely, there's not a clear mathematical kind of notation to this idea because it's just incidental. I mean, at least this is the kind of resistance that I get from analytical philosophers. But if people are into phenomenology, existentialism, philosophical anthropology, I don't tend to get much resistance from those. I don't know what's
precisely the problem. How come we have how come under one philosophy we have two approaches? One denies it completely, the other accepts it completely. It's kind of it poses a question about philosophy itself, or how we think that something actually is philosophical.
Imagine if, for example, we take an academic text, just a classical philosophical text, and we just translate it into this dialogical form, making it into a fiction. We didn't really change the essence of the argumentation, the points that are being made, but we turned what is considered really a proper academic article into something that is more problematically classified as academic. That's interesting because the arguments are the same, just the form.
So there could be an experiment made, to send a particular piece of paper in one form written as a strict scientific article, and in the sense of analytical philosophy, and then the same thing but in a dialogical form or something like a play or a fable, and then send it, to different journals and see how will they respond to. That could be a good experiment to check. Don't react.
And yes, did you say that it would be a good experiment? Or that it would be. Okay, I thought maybe
to play a little bit.
Yes.
the experiment. I did submit a dialogue once and it was accepted, but I didn't have a second non-dialogic version. So maybe you should try to do both at once. Yeah.
Maybe. Yeah. Maybe the one with the dialogical form will actually be cited instead of this one, and so you're going to apply it as a.
We didn't get a lot of resistance for that.
I would just like to invite the audience once more. You can at any time raise your hand and join the discussion if you have. Okay, Željko.
Thank you, actually, everybody, for speaking in English just for my sake. So I'm really thankful.
And Luca mentioned that in some way we have to make clear difference between reality, terms like reality, simulation, fiction or fictionality, and virtuality. And this is the core of this problem. This is in some way a modal logical problem, philosophical problem. If we clear which kind of possibility we use in fictional space or in fictional worlds, and on the other way in the virtual world, we already solved some problems. For example, there is a. What do you mean? Which is the difference between fictional world and virtual world? I'm not sure that you make clear this difference. You use fiction and virtual as some kind of as it was the same. It is synonym. Yeah. No. Can we talk about this? Can we clear this difference, if there is any difference between, for the first?
A small question. So you mentioned the author De Groos or something, philosophizing theory, science fiction stories, something like that. And yeah, and the subtitle is Exploring the Boundaries of the Possibilities. So I'm interested in, the author also was interested in modalities and these kind of questions, because he mentions both possibilities and stories in a title, if you know something about that.
Yeah, I read it, yes. And so can I try?
Yes, of course.
Oh, thanks. Part of my work is in philosophy of fiction. And when we give something like a text, the property, or recognize in a text the property of being fictional, is that the author or the creator of that text intended for us to imagine and not to believe that kind of thing. So a fictional thing is that which is meant to be imagined and not believed. Now, when a world is a virtual world, obviously is a fictional world. The difference between the two is that we call, at least in philosophy of technology or philosophy of fiction, we call a virtual world a fictional world that is supported, generated, and accessed through the digital medium, right? Not through, say, text or our imagination, but when a fictional world is accessed through, supported by a digital medium, then we call it a virtual world. So it is a form of fictional world, only through computers.
That means that virtuality is some kind of subordinate term of fictionality.
Yes.
But you talk about invention. Fiction is not. Fiction is an invention, but the other kind of the other sort of invention as virtuality. Fiction is fixed. Fiction is the space of fictionality is made. The interaction with this space is interpretation. You don't act in this space.
Absolutely. Yeah.
In virtual space, in virtual world, you have the other possibility to act, to interact in the other ways, in the reality of virtuality, to say. This is the different model, in modal logical way. This is the different level, the different art of the different sort of possibility. Both are invented, but fiction is fixed, is made, and you interact this as hermeneutical way, in interpretational way. It is some other kind of openness.
Do you know about role-playing games?
No.
Probably that's where the question comes from. Let's say that, do you know LARP, Nordic LARPing or something like this? Let's suppose that we decide that we here are a group of elves that are on a mission and need to do something or some other things. Part of the narrative that we, let's say, live through is scripted. But we also have a degree of freedom that is not just hermeneutical in how we interpret our role and understand that situation, but we could also act in a way that doesn't, I mean, that affects the story, so to speak.
In virtual space or in fictional space?
In actual space.
In
Actual space, in meat space, as somebody would say. So there are some forms of fictions that are interactive and shared in this world. And you could say, like, I'm not an elf, therefore you're taking up a fictional role that is interactive at the same time. So the distinction, fiction is that which is not interactive, doesn't necessarily hold for a number of elements like child play, role-playing games, and those kind of things. So do you see why I think fiction is a subordinate category to virtuality? They're not two things that stand on the side. You might have a virtual world on which you only have hermeneutical possibilities, and you might have a game in which you have, in real life, interactive possibilities. So the two are actually mixed. There's not like clear sets between the two. We can talk about it also, like if you take Greg Curry's, the theories on fiction, they're precisely based on this idea, or Kendall Walton.
This actually brings us to the notion from from philosophy of play called the circle of play, or the magic circle, where we use in case of, for example, live action role playing games where we are now playing as elves. We use imagination to actually create a parastructure of reality in which we are interacting the same way we play when we play with children at home or something like that, in which we are interacting with everybody in a kind of fictional way, but this fiction is actually being generated through our factual existence. But we have to pay attention to the fact that virtuality is sometimes used more broadly. So we have, for example, it is often used to reference the time-space of interaction in real life through digitalized platforms. For example, sometimes people say if you're on the internet communicating on forums or something, that you are on a virtual platform or you're in a virtual world. So we can make maybe a distinction between virtually extended world and virtually fictional virtual world. Virtually extended world is this primary world which is extended through digital platforms, and when we encounter in digital platforms a fictional content, then we have a fictional system or fictional world which is virtually based. So this distinction can be made because the notion of virtuality, the world virtual, is used in more broad context. I would like to mention one very crazy hybrid of this interaction, which is a video game, multiplayer video game called Moirai. This was actually a social experiment, very simple game, where you have one quest. You have to go into a mine where a person disappeared, and you're trying to find her. And you have several points of interaction with various characters, very simplified interaction. And when you encounter a particular person, a character, when you enter the mines, they tell you something. And eventually players realize that this text that the characters are telling you are the texts that the other players left when they finished the game. And then they started to create streamlining. They started to create streams of different stories based on the possibilities that were made by this simple interaction. And then some stories were funny, some stories were dreadful, horrific, some stories were dramatic, depending on what the players eventually left when they wrote this text. And they also would receive a feedback through a server that was used by the developers. They would receive feedback on their mail about what has happened, what was generated, who responded to their story and stuff like that. Which it's an insanely hybrid form of real life interacting through a specific game, creating and generating something that is half fictional, half realistic, because you could have also used Moirai, for example, to send a message, help me, you know, a thief is attacking my house, and if you know how the game functions, I can go to that person's house and help them, I know, prevent a thief from attacking it. Moirai, a crazy experiment, which eventually the game was shut down. because they started, the trolls started to exploit it and make it very sexually explicit and stuff like that. They destroyed basically the game. But during the time where while people who were playing were actually engaged in finding out how they can use this, system to communicate and create new stories, you actually have a mashup of real life interaction and fictional interaction. It's a very interesting experiment they made.
I want to emphasize that I use the virtuality as not as some space that are generated or supported through by technical means or technical equipment. Not necessarily. Virtuality is a term of model logic. It is the term that
Possibility.
Some kind of possibility that it is virtuality. Something is virtual if it is in effect but not in appearance. This is the classical definition. Okay. And this is that is what I mean. What is the difference between reality, fictionality, simulacrum, yeah, and virtuality and virtual phenomena? This is what I mean. The whole time we talk about technically supported or generated virtual spaces. Of course, there are. Okay.
It really depends on the content, because you're really putting into model philosophy. And I was taking a perspective of philosophy of fiction or philosophy of technology, and they have very different definitions. There are at least like 5 definitions of what it means to be virtual, starting from Aristotle with the idea of dynamism and potentiality and so on and so forth. So I'm not an expert in model philosophy, so I cannot tell how those concepts are classified and described in your particular angle. So I can tell you how we use those words in this branch of philosophy. So I'm sorry if that is not convincing.
Term does not apply to how it is used, really how it is used in this context. That's true, yeah.
Philosophy of technology, it will be used. This difference, it's very important to technologies some as ubiquitous computing and pervasive computing. They are defined as real virtuality, and this is possible if you use strong, precise terms of virtuality, reality, possibility, and so on, and fictionality, and so on. Yeah. This is possible to make this difference between virtual reality and real virtuality. For example, okay.
David Chalmers does that.
Seeing how it helps clarify the relations, that would be something that would be worthy of exploration. Yeah.
Okay. For example, in technology, some like as ubiquitous computing or pervasive computing, they are defined as the possibilities of these technologies are real virtuality. What does it mean? There are real spaces. They are constituted like virtual spaces by these new technologies. And if we, and there are other problems, if we try to use these technologies and these spaces like instruments, not like media, we have wrong terms. We have wrong conclusions about our use or our connections to these technologies. These are other problems. But if we made this categorical mistake at first, we have a whole bunch of problems in ethical way and the other ways. This is important, I think. These are open questions, but I mean, this is important. Why is these distinctions are important? Okay,
I have a question. So regarding this distinction between a fiction and virtuality, where interactivity is connected to the virtual and not with fiction, in which, as I understood, interactivity is only connected to interpretation. Yeah, simplified. So when we have these phenomenons of fiction, which is not yet done, which is happening, in which we have a branching narrative and the player who is choosing how the story will develop, or we have multiple authors of the story. What can we define as fiction here? Is fiction something which comes at the end of this, and we just see players as authors, as some author of the literary work was in that process before he published the game? So what could be the fiction according to that classification in these examples?
Of course, there are fictional moments in virtuality, if by the developing of these video games or virtual spaces, as such, of course. But there is these are not fictional spaces. There are narratives. There are some kind of. That's why it is possible to make from. You mentioned that, Luca, this Last of Us, they made from virtual interaction, fictional interaction. You have to interpret, to understand, or to interact on this way with this fictional space, this film, yeah, this narrative, this. We interpret it, we understand this. But in virtual space, you interact. You are this little girl, and then you are the father or whatever. You have to interact with possibilities in other way as in fictional space. In fictional space, there are not only narratives, there are pictures. For example, they try to, in theater, to make theater more interactional. But they don't change really this fictional character of theater, for example. The audience is invited to interact with and to change something, but there is other way. This is not the interaction as we know this from these virtual spaces. These are possibilities of fictional world. Of course, there are some
overlap.
Yeah. Yeah. Or some switch between these categorical levels. Yeah. But there are differences. If we understand, for example, the old. I'm sorry, I talk too much. Do you want? Come to
the conclusion.
I made my moderator point clear.
Yes, because we've been here for 2 hours, so that is why I would like to ask you. This is typically the time where we either end the discussion or make a break and then continue after the break. I mean, what is your preference?
I feel like we could wrap it up, right? Yeah, we could wrap it up.
We can change the medium.
Yeah, we can continue with a cup of coffee. But any final comments?
I just comment that we can agree to disagree. For your point of view, it looks in one way. From our point of view, it's useful to categorize it that way. And I think for us, it makes more sense to see it this way. Obviously, I'm not saying you're wrong. From a very analytical and logical point of view, you can see things that we cannot see. And that's fine. Isn't that philosophy, precisely? take another point of view and see new things. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying, like, we use terms differently. And
yeah, I also think that I think that this is just about two levels of analyzing, and that we can combine these two things. We just have to clear up what is actually everything that is considered under notions that are used here and notions that you applied in. I think that the terminology how you're using it goes a bit kind of like goes out. It's kind of like an outer layer that through which we can then understand how we are using it in this level.
the ontological side, and we look
Yeah,
more
it
player
moves towards,
experiences.
yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
for this amazing discussion.
Thank you.
And that is it for today.